Hey, class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. Sorry, still getting used to the mixing the PowerPoint and Zoom apparently, but welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are at the halfway point of the course in terms of the textbook. We are in chapter 8 looking at interpersonal communication, how we can use communication to adjust to the world around us. So first section of this will be looking at the processes or process of internal or interpersonal communication. So you should be able to outline various aspects of the communication process and be able to discuss important differences between face-to-face and computer-mediated communication, because nowadays so much of our communication is through avenues like this, over a computer or over your phone, and so a lot of research has gone into looking at the differences. So sort of table setting, interpersonal communication is defined as an interactional process in which one person sends a message to another. So some kind of key things breaking this down. It does involve at least two people. There are times I might sit in my kitchen, and kind of think to myself, well, where did I leave my keys, or where did I leave my phone? But that's not necessarily interpersonal communication. I'm mostly just thinking out loud. It is also a process involving a series of actions, and it is usually, we're not talking about a one way, like I can tell somebody something and then they go and do it, but communication in terms of it's more directional, it's more conversational, bi-directional, interactional, rather than a one-way street. And the main components of any kind of communication, we have the sender, the person who is initiating the message, the one delivering the message. So if I'm speaking to you right now, I am the sender. And if you're watching this video over YouTube or on Canvas or wherever, you are the receiver, the one who is the target of the message. And the message itself is the information that is trying to be conveyed from sender to the receiver. The channel is the sensory channel by which it's received. So right now you can hear me. Maybe you can see my I'm moving my hands too, so you can see that as well. But primarily the channel is auditory. You don't even necessarily have to watch the video. Obviously, it would help to kind of follow along with the PowerPoint. But so in this case, I guess there's two channels. You can visually watch the PowerPoint. You can also auditorily, you can hear me. There's noise, anything that interferes. So for example, noise could be, maybe somebody talking in the background, like literal noise. Maybe noise is, oh, I'm, texting on my phone right now instead of watching this video. And the context is the environment. Like the context is you are in your psychology of adjustment class. You're watching a video on interpersonal communication related to psychology of adjustment. So kind of makes sense. Maybe in another context that wouldn't make sense. Like if you were in your math class and all of a sudden this video popped up, the context might be kind of weird in that case. And a lot of what we now understand and think about, interpersonal communication isn't just like face-to-face interaction. And it now involves electronically communicated communication, electronically mediated communication, meaning the communication is taking place through technology. Maybe that is sending a text, maybe that's jumping on Zoom like this, like I'm doing to record this. So it's really changing the dynamics of communication, especially in terms of convenience. However, it's important to keep in mind, though, technology definitely offers a certain degree of convenience that's not present in other forms of communication, but there are certain rules in terms of using things like cell phones. For example, like, private, used to be your phone conversations were maybe you kept privately in your home or maybe at a payphone, but now we carry our phones everywhere. And we can have those conversations anywhere, anytime, but it's important that you do keep your phone on quiet, especially when it'll disturb others, like maybe in your class, maybe at a movie, maybe at a library, for example. You want to keep your calls short. It's probably not a good idea. Like if you have this really much needed heart-to-heart talk, if you're in public at a fast food restaurant or something and you're having this like hour-long conversation, you're probably going to get some weird looks. And keep calls shot out of the ear, keep your calls out of the earshot of others. Like, I think it's okay every now, it's probably fine, oh, hello, take a call, whatever. But, if you're just sitting next to somebody and they're trying to enjoy their experience, enjoy their meal or whatever, and you're on your phone the whole time, that could be kind of rude. But other differences between face and face and electronically, there are other differences as well. I think about like, the immediacy of a conversation. When you're talking to someone face to face, and you say something to somebody, they typically expect a response, right then and there. But if that same conversation, if it's over text, they might send you a text and maybe you don't respond for another hour, But if you did that in person, that would be kind of weird. But electronically mediated communication definitely changes the game. So here's an example of where context, kind of time and place, where it does matter in terms of following the etiquette of cell phone usage. It's certainly fine to have a conversation in some public spaces, but in the middle of a movie, that's not only just rude to the people around you, but would just get you kicked out of the movie, and you would miss out on the money, you'd miss out on the movie, and all that fun stuff. So here, some things about physics, some other dimensions or elements to consider. Physical distance, face to face, you're typically in the same place, same time, versus the internet. That completely changes it. Like I can have a conversation with a friend in another time zone and another country on another side of the planet, really, based, using the internet. And face to face, we are not anonymous. I guess you could wear a mask or something and be anonymous, but for the most part, when you're face to face, you kind of see who you're talking to. But or the internet, you might, I'm not saying you personally, but people might hide behind a username and an avatar, and you may not really truly know who the person is. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over all of these aspects, these dimensions, but just say, just be aware of how your communication might differ when you're in one setting face to face versus another internet. There's different expectations, different etiquettes, and so anyways, and we even think, and this is also starting to raise concerns or raise, awareness of things like, your privacy and your security when using electronic mediated forms of communication, specifically social networking sites, which, social networking sites have a lot of benefits. Especially when it comes to, kind of having a virtual presence online, kind of presenting yourself to the world and your virtual self. And this is obviously very helpful for people who might be shy, might be maybe personality structure, maybe more introverted rather than extroverted. However, kind of putting yourself out like that, and especially in a place like social media, that is kind of, even though it's private to some extent, like you can have a private social media page, but what you put out is to the social media public, like to all the people that in that social network. And there's a lot of research that's kind of looked at this loss of privacy. If people, if you're not careful about this, there's some research that shows that students, for example, the things they've posted on their social media might be brought up later on when trying to get a job. For example, like maybe you posted something on Twitter or Facebook when you were a teenager, and now you're an adult and you totally forgot about it, because why would you think about it? It was years ago, and all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, this is haunting me. So it's important to be mindful about what you share. So there are privacy protections. There are privacy protections in place, making sure your profile is private, your pages, all those things like that. But a lot of people fail to do so because they think, oh, well, that's not going to happen to me. That's sort of that optimistic bias. It might happen to other people, but it's not happening to me. And, it probably is going to happen to you. So, thinking about communication, how this relates to adjustment. Well, effective communication is absolutely essential, like in almost every aspect of our life. Like effectively being able to communicate with your boss, with your partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, spouse, friend, whoever. It is tied to satisfying relationships. Both, good communication is associated with positive relationships in terms of satisfaction, and poor communication is strongly tied to why relationships might break up. Okay, now we're switching gears and looking at nonverbal communication. So you should be able to list 5 general principles of nonverbal communication, discuss the dynamics of personal space and what can be discerned from facial cues and eye contact, summarize the research findings on body movement, posture, gestures, touch, and paralanguage in communication, and understand the difficulty in detecting deception and clarify the nonverbal cues linked to deception. So what do we mean by nonverbal cues? Basically everything else. So most interpersonal communication, everything kind of falls under this umbrella. Nonverbal is when we're talking about we're transmitting, communication through means of symbols, other than words, so it could be your body language, it could be facial expressions, it could be overt behaviors, but we're just not using words. And there's a ton of information that is conveyed, via nonverbal communication. So understanding and being able to recognize the kind of nonverbal cues that are dropped in communication can be absolutely essential for adjustment. So some principles about nonverbal communication. Typically, we're talking about conveying emotions, facial expressions, body posture can really tell a lot. If somebody gives you a piece of news and your first reaction is your eyes get really big and, you got that deer in the headlight look, that's conveying one thing compared to if somebody gives you a piece of news and you're smiling, you're happy, we can say a lot before we ever even, technically open our mouth and let the words out. Nonverbal communication is multi-channeled, meaning we might use facial expressions, eye contact, gestures, vocal tone, intonation, body language, all of these things. It's ambiguous, meaning sometimes it can be difficult to interpret. What is somebody kind of slouched and hunched over, closed body? What does that mean? It might mean something to different people. Maybe that person literally is cold and they're just trying to maintain body heat, or maybe they're, depressed and sad. Who knows? It could be a lot of things. It may contradict the verbal message. Like you may tell somebody one thing, but your body language says the other. Like you may say, "Oh, I'm really excited about this job opportunity," but you have this kind of like, "Yeah, I guess I'm like," if I say like, "I'm very excited about this," versus, "Man, I'm excited." Almost having a tone kind of, or maybe, some sarcasm in it a little bit, just changing up, just changing your body, changing your facial expression, changing your tone can completely change or contradict the message you might be sending. It is also culture bound. Nonverbal signals vary from one culture to another. I think about the United States, like in the South, the Midwest, smiling at people. If you see a stranger and you smile, a lot of times you'll get a smile back, and it's just perceived as kind of what you do. But if you go to New York City and you're walking around, let's say Manhattan in Times Square, and it's super busy, and you smile at a stranger and you make eye contact and smile, that person may think you're crazy and be like, "Why the heck are you staring at me?" It might be interpreted completely different because that's a different cultural expectation. So another aspect of nonverbal communication, or nonverbal communication, excuse me, is personal space. Different elements of it is personal space. And there's a whole study of personal space called proxemics. And looking at this zone of space that surrounds a person, that is felt like this is my space that belongs to me. And some people have different preferences in terms of their personal space. Like some people have virtually no personal space, like they'll get right into your bubble, so to speak, or some people prefer a lot of personal space. And we've even seen the discussion of personal space grow tremendously with the outbreak of COVID-19. Preferences in terms of personal space will depend on the nature of the relationship. Like we're more likely to let strangers, or we're more likely to keep distance from strangers, but you're more likely to, let's say, have a loved one, be in close proximity. Social norms, culture, are you cultures of bowing, for example, or cultures of shaking hands is a reflection of this personal space. Specific situations, some situations, maybe a more professional, formal setting, maybe you have a more distance personal space. But if it's informal, more friendly, more relaxed, maybe it's a closer personal space. Social status can also influence that. So here are what people who study proxemics have kind of identified. There are 4 stages, and it ultimately is a reflection of relationships and situations. So zone 1 is considered the intimate zone, intimate distance zone. It's pretty close, about almost a foot and a half at most. And this is where you're most likely to expect like parents, children, spouses, partners, people like that. Personal distance zone is 18 inches, 4 feet. This might be for close friends, somebody you want to sit down and with, have coffee with. You're not going to be right in each other's faces, but you're close enough that you can maybe carry on an intimate conversation. Social distance zone number 3, this might be with coworkers, social gatherings, a party, friends. 4 to 12 feet. We might even throw pandemics in here, the social distancing. And then public distance zone, maybe, for example, if you're going to see a speaker or a concert or a stranger or somebody important, that you don't necessarily really know, you might be talking about distances of 12 feet or more. If you go to a concert, you could be sitting hundreds of feet back from the musical performance, but you're still able to have some degree of communication. Like you can obviously hear them. I guess that would be kind of more of a one-way street in that example, but still. So other elements are facial expressions. We convey certain emotions, basic emotions. There are some that are universally expressed. We'll look at on the next slide, and these are recognized by people around the world. We might consider throwing anxiety. There's some research that considers maybe anxiety should be included in this list. And these emotions might occur in ambiguous situations where perceived threats are unclear. So that sort of anxious, kind of fearful response. But there are cultural specific norms in terms of display rules. Like it would be inappropriate to laugh at a funeral. It would be appropriate to cry and appear somber at a funeral, for example. But here are examples of universally conveyed emotions like fear, disgust, happiness, and anger. Meaning if you go to pretty much anywhere in the world and you display the facial expressions of happiness, a smile, you're going to get a pretty high agreement in terms of people recognizing, okay, this person is smiling at me. They're likely conveying some degree of friendliness, some degree of happiness as well. Eye contact is another aspect of nonverbal communication. We can measure or think about eye contact in terms of like the duration, meaning like the more intensely focused we are on somebody with our eye contact, that's considered like, that you're paying attention, you're engaged with this person. But however, we need to be careful because eye contact is viewed differently in different cultures. For example, European Americans, high levels of eye contact is considered a good thing socially. However, eye contact in other cultures might be offensive, like indigenous native tribes, for example, in the United States. You see that, it's considered disrespectful to look people directly in the eyes. So eye contact is important, but we have to kind of definitely be in consideration of time, place, and culture. So eye contact also is associated with the intensity of feeling. So in terms of positive contacts, like, when you're in love with somebody or attracted to somebody, or a romantic partner, for example, you might gaze at them longingly and you might not break eye contact for a while. But flipping around on the other side of things, more of a negative contacts, maybe when somebody cuts you off in traffic, for example, you might literally just stare a hole, not literally, I shouldn't say that. You might stare a hole right through that person because you're just so upset at them. You're so mad and you really want to convey it to them. And eye contact is also influenced by things like status, race, gender, a number of factors. So, if we think about it in terms of staring, there's a lot of interesting research in how this is perceived, how that's perceived by various genders. You can read about this research. The social visual dominance behavior, men who are in a higher position of power tend to score higher compared to women. Control group, same thing. But if we have women who are in a position of higher, it completely flips around. So you can go ahead and read about it. It is correlation research, but I think it's really fascinating stuff to read about. Body language is another aspect of nonverbal communication, and kinesics is the study of communication through body movement. So people who, for example, gesture wildly as they speak versus somebody who maybe is a little more tight, with their body movements. You're conveying all kinds of information. Depending on your posture, might be having an open posture where your arms are uncrossed, maybe down at your sides conveys being relaxed versus a closed posture. Maybe you have your arms crossed like this and it conveys, being defensive or tense perhaps. And then hand gestures emphasize the words we speak. Like, so some people really use their hands demonstratively kind of in line with their speech, and something, to be mindful of when you're speaking. I believe this is, if I remember right, I believe this is a picture of Lyndon Johnson, who was, considered somewhat of a close talker, also one who was quite demonstrative, not afraid to point as he spoke, not afraid to get into your face. Other aspects of nonverbal communication is touch, but this has a lot to do with status and power, who, where, and whom we decide to touch. There are norms, for example, of where we touch friends. Like, it's one thing to, it's to pat a friend on the shoulder. But there are obviously parts of the human body, even if they're your friend, that you just obviously would not touch. In sports, for example, it's common, like sometimes you give, a teammate or a coach might give their player a pat on their backside, on their butt, but even if a friend really well, if you pat your friend on the butt and say good game, they might be like, what are you doing? Like, one, I mean, at the very least, they might give you a weird look. Two, I mean, you're kind of borderlining on like, harassment. So just be really careful about that. So norms in terms of where we touch friends, we do see research shows that female pairs tend to touch more often than male pairs, and perhaps that has a lot to do with gender expectations about how males convey emotions and affection and things like that. Cross gender touch is interpreted as support by females, but as power or sexual interest by males. So depending on who you touch, where you touch, how you touch, when, I mean, all of these different contextual factors are at play. You have to be, really careful and mindful of this. There's also paralanguage, which is all vocal cues in terms of your verbal messages. So maybe, your emphasis on certain words. I mean, if you change the way you emphasize a given word in a sentence, it can completely change the context of how people understand your meaning. Internet communication, also can substitute some of these cues. You might capitalize certain letters, you might use emoticons, emojis, things like that. To kind of convey, you might put things like LOL at the end to convey a certain aspect. And so thinking about nonverbal communication, this is oftentimes thought of as, okay, we can use nonverbal cues to understand deception, indicate are often different, but however, we have to be really careful because there's a pretty big gap in terms of the cues that people think are related to deception and the ones that actually are. For example, liars will often say less, not more. Like there's this belief that, if you have a very elaborate, lengthy story, that must mean you're lying, when in fact, the research shows liars will say less. Liars are not necessarily good storytellers and include less unusual content in their stories, not more, not elaborate. Liars are more tense and make a more negative impression on the listener. And sometimes, in some cases, polygraph tests are attempted to be used to discern truth from fiction. And so a polygraph records fluctuations in physiological arousal as an individual answers questions. And these are very controversial in terms of whether or not they should be allowed in court, trials, testimonies, but you still see these in use with employment, police, criminal justice system. But these devices monitor your arousal, your autonomic arousal, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, perspiration, galvanic skin response, like are you sweating, and the validity of these, the validity, reliability is highly questionable. There's lots of error rates, so we need to be really careful. So here's a chart kind of looking at nonverbal cues and their relationship to deception. Speech hesitation, yes, liars hesitate more. Are cues available, or believed to be assigned? Yes. So you can kind of look and see where perhaps the discrepancies are, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward. Nonverbal sensitivity. Some people are more or less, better able to accurately decode nonverbal cues. And the research shows women tend to be better at encoding and decoding nonverbal messages. But that might be linked to motivation. It's not necessarily caused by being, a woman versus being a man. But anyone can improve their nonverbal skills in terms of being able to encode and decode those things. Now we're going to move towards, or we're going to look at how to move towards being a more effective communicator. Identify 5 steps in making small talk, explain why self-disclosure is important in adjustment, discuss the role of self-disclosure, analyze cultural and gender differences in self-disclosure, and then cite 4 points good listeners need to keep in mind when communicating. So conversational skills, there are 5 sort of steps identified by psychologists when thinking about how do we get good at small talk. Again, it's another skill. The more we practice, the better. So 1, indicate you're open to conversation by maybe making an observation. Right now in Oklahoma, it's really hot, so maybe you make a comment about the heat. Introduce yourself. Use your name. Look the person in the eye. Select a topic that others can relate to. So again, maybe right now the weather would be one, or high gas prices, or COVID, things like that, maybe, or maybe not. Some of those might be politically loaded and you want to be careful. Keep the conversation ball rolling, maybe, be the one in charge, and then make a smooth exit, don't just do an Irish goodbye where you just disappear. Maybe find a nice transition point to wrap things up, and maybe make it a point to talk again if that is possible. In one aspect, going beyond small talk, we might want to engage in self-disclosure, where we share personal information about ourselves to another person. And this is really important for the purpose of adjustment, because when we share problems, this is really good for our mental health. Simply getting things off our chest and sharing them with others and getting feedback can be really good for our mental health. It also helps build relationships. It also leads to feelings of closeness within those relationships. That's how you kind of maybe cement the bonds that you form with other people. And also in terms of relationships, romantic relationships, it's strongly associated with the satisfaction of those relationships, whether or not they will continue or not. So, and that level of self-disclosure will change and develop and evolve over the course of a relationship. At first, maybe there's high levels of self-disclosure. Everything is new. You're sharing a lot. There's a lot of intimacy, but eventually that will kind of taper off. In more established relationships, disclosures don't necessarily have to be reciprocated. Maybe you open up and without the expectation of reciprocity, and maybe later on that person will open up, but it's not as sort of the two-way street as you might expect at the beginning. The move away from reciprocal self-disclosure in terms of you share, I share, usually happens for a couple of reasons. One, there's more need for support than reciprocal disclosure from one person. Like one person just needs more support at that time. Maybe you're at different places in your life. The need for privacy outweighs the need for mutual self-disclosure. So maybe some things you are maybe just keeping closer to the best. In terms of gender differences, females tend to disclose more than males, and this tends to be strongest with same gender friendships. And in terms of self-disclosure and responding with empathy, this is really good for fostering intimate relationships differently in males and in females. So what can you do to be a better listener? I mean, that's one of the biggest things you can do to improve your communication style is just listening, being a better listener. One, signal your interest. Like if you're on your phone and looking down at your phone when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody, you're really not signaling your interest. Being face-to-face, squarely, leaning towards them rather than away. Don't cross your arms and legs, maintaining consistent eye contact. Listen to the other person before you respond. Don't just wait for them to finish talking so you can talk. You're actually listening. Be more of an active listener where you might ask for clarification when something doesn't make sense, paraphrase, letting them know you understood, and also be mindful of those nonverbal cues we just spent a lot of time talking about. Okay, so kind of on the flip side, what about communication problems? What happens when communication is broken down, like the famous Led Zeppelin song? So we'll look at some common responses to communication apprehension and identify 3 barriers to effective communication. So what is communication apprehension? It is usually an anxiety that comes from, talking with somebody else. And this might look like avoidance, where we simply choose not to participate, withdrawal, maybe clamming up, disruption, you're not making fluid statements, over communication, you're overly speaking, you're nervous, maybe your words are going 100 miles an hour. What are some barriers? Being defensive, protecting yourself from being hurt, kind of that ego defensiveness that Freud talked about and could be conscious or unconscious. Ambushing, listening carefully only to attack. You're not necessarily really listening. You're just waiting for your opportunity to jump in and make your case. Preoccupation, you are more self-observed and you're not equally allowing the other person to contribute. And oftentimes problems in communication can lead to interpersonal conflict. So we want to look at the pros, and you'll be able to assess the pros and cons of avoiding versus facing conflict, describe 5 personal styles for dealing with conflict, and then articulate some tips for coping effectively with interpersonal conflict. Conflict's unavoidable, so we got to figure out how to deal with it. So the beliefs that people have about conflict, most people believe any kind of conflict is bad, but honestly, that's not true. Conflict is it's unavoidable. It happens. I mean, we're not all going to agree on things. Not every relationship you're going to be on the same page all the time. And conflicts can be small, they can be big, but it's going to happen at some point. So avoiding conflict usually is counterproductive and ends up leading to a self-perpetuating cycle where more conflict happens. You avoid it, kind of perpetuates more conflict. So the research shows it is better to confront conflict more constructively so that you can air any potential issues and resolve them effectively. So, maybe this looks like a fight with your partner, your spouse, your boyfriend, your girlfriend. But again, the research shows getting it out in the open is the only way you're going to be able to actually work on it. So here's how this kind of iterative relationship, if we think conflict is bad, what this might look like. So if we think it's bad, we get nervous about conflict when experiencing it. We might avoid it as long as possible, which honestly allows the conflict to, gets out of control to the point where it now has to be confronted. And then because it's gotten to the worst point possible, now we handle it badly. And it kind of reinforces this idea of conflict is bad and kind of starts this whole cycle over again. So there's different kind of styles for managing conflict or dimensions. You can engage in avoiding or withdrawal. This usually is indicative of low concern for self and others. You can have more of a accommodating, where you're much more concerned about others, lower concern for yourself. Competing, high concern for self, low concern for others. Compromising, kind of moderate on both sides. And then collaborating. This is ultimately the kind of the best solution in terms of thinking about it from a psychology standpoint. Compromising allows you to kind of split the difference, finding a solution that is best for both sides of the conflict, not just one or the other. So if you kind of look at the dimension of concern for self, concern for others, compromise is kind of that sweet spot in the middle in terms of resolving conflict. So how do we deal with conflict constructively, meaningfully, effectively? Be open and honest in communication. Be trustful, be willing to be vulnerable, use specific behavior to describe the person's annoying habits rather than general statements like, you always do this, you're so inconsiderate, you're rude, you're blah, blah, blah. You might just say, hey, the last couple of days, I noticed you've been doing X, Y, and Z. And, it's not necessarily talking about who that person is as an individual, but just something tangibly they've done. Avoid loaded words, hyperbolic words, never, always, things like that. Use a positive approach and help the other person save face. Limit complaints to recent behaviors, like don't bring up stuff that happened a year ago, 5 months ago, even 5 days ago. You need to be focused on the here and now. Assume responsibility for your own feelings, and then try to use more of an assertive communication style. Bring it up, but you're not, you're assertive. You're not going to get pushed over. Okay, developing more of an assertive communication style. How do we go about doing that? So distinguishing among assertive, submissive, and aggressive communication, and list 5 steps that lead to more assertive communication. Assertiveness is just simply acting in your own best interest by expressing your thoughts, your feelings very openly and honestly. And this is different from submissive communication, which might involve giving into others, where you might you're not doing those things. You're not openly and honestly expressing how you really feel, and a lot of times this might feel like you're being pushed over. This is also in contrast with aggressive communication, which is focusing on saying and getting what you want, no matter if it's at the expense of others. Even if it's your truth, you're probably your attempt more is to hurt somebody else. So the research shows, in terms of adaptiveness, assertive communication is more adaptive and compared to submissive or aggressive communication. And assertiveness training is a skill that can be fostered and developed with practice, with skills. So things you can do. Obviously, this isn't like the end all be all, but first step is to understand what assertive communication is. Don't forget about those nonverbal cues. Monitor your own assertive communication. So maybe identify when you're not being assertive, and maybe take notes of that. Maybe there are certain people or topics or situations where you start to fall out of that assertiveness. Observe another person's assertive communication. Find a model, somebody who maybe you look up to who is an assertive person, and use them as a way to, a model to look at. Practice. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Rehearse, whether it's role playing, covert rehearsal, practice these skills. That's the only way you're going to really develop more of an assertive style of communication. And then adopt an assertive attitude. It's not just in your speech, but be assertive in your behavior, in your aspects in everyday life. So that's going to do it for chapter number 8. We are now past the halfway point of this course, which is very exciting to say. Stick around. We're going to finish up the second half. We have chapters 9 through 16. So we're halfway there. Pat yourself on the back. And I'll see you next time for chapter 16. Take care. Or chapters 9 through 16. Sorry, we're not jumping right to chapter 16. That's my fault. We're going to chapter 9. Take care. Bye.